All righty, welcome everybody. My paper is called Adolescence Lost, and after I've read it, you'll know why I chose that title. World War II for the Netherlands began on May 10, 1940, and ended on May 5, 1945, when the German occupational forces surrendered and beat their retreat to the Heimat. That day, May the 5th, was an unforgettable day. For the people in Holland, the war and the occupation lasted 5 years. In the ongoing sweep of history, 5 years is not such a long time. But for those who had felt in their bodies and souls the oppression, suffering, brutality, hunger, and death, these were 5 very long years. Worst off were the Jews. Few survived. Most perished in Hitler's death camps. The word Holocaust will forever be called by the horrible fate that struck them. We cannot comprehend this monstrous rape on a segment of the human race. Germany's capitulations in 1945 formally marked the end of the war that engulfed virtually all of Europe. The armistice was also much more. It sealed the fate. It sealed the fate of Nazism, a demonic system that was fueled by the belief in the superiority of the so-called Aryan race. The world remains horror-struck at the forces of evil that lashed the world and tore it apart, wiping out millions of lives. With a measure of incredulity, we ask how a civilized nation, a nation that gave us Beethoven, Handel, and Brahms, could sink to such depths of depravity. Um, I just want to show you a book that they have, which has all the names of the Dutch people who were killed in the concentration camps. There were 140,000 Jews in Holland before the war started, and 30,000 survived, 110,000, just Dutch Jews. Well, how did it start? On May the 10th, 1940, is a Friday morning I will never forget. It was 4 in the morning when my sister and I were awakened by shooting, resulting in a plane crash less than half a mile from our home. It was the beginning of the invasion of Holland. Death was everywhere, around every corner, in every street. Death came as a German soldier. He left behind a swastika for every grave. A ranting and raving furor convulsed the world with death. Unprepared, Dutch soldiers fought with weapons dating back to World War I. Defense ended in death. The war lasted only 5 days. We were living in The Hague at that time. Where I lost my. We were in The Hague at that time. I was a 12-year-old seventh grader, and my sister was 10. We could not believe that anyone could bother our peaceful small country, but we were important because of our long coastline, the access to Great Britain. We spent 5 days during which there actually was little fighting, playing Monopoly with our friends, a game which I've seldom played since. On the 5th day, even playing Monopoly abruptly ended. Sometime that afternoon, Rotterdam, only 20 miles from where we lived, was bombed. We sat in our basement for what seemed like eternity, and when it stopped, we knew that the war was over. Little did we know that it only just begun. That evening, the four of us, along with some very close friends, drove to IJmuiden, a harbor town on the North Sea. My parents, fearing what was coming, decided that we had to leave the country. I can still hear my mother tell her housekeeper where she could reach us in England after the war. We went in our friend's car. However, he was so shaken that he could not drive. My father, who had had a terrible automobile accident in 1933 and who had not driven since, took over. How we arrived in IJmuiden, I will never know. Barricades were everywhere. When we got there, the town was aflame. This was the city with hundreds of oil tanks, which were all set afire. We found ourselves at the docks with thousands of other persons, mostly Jewish, all trying to leave the country. It became soon apparent that this would be impossible. There was one small boat with standing room only, which was still leaving. The last ones had sailed that afternoon. My parents decided that the small boat would be suicide. We later found out that it hit a mine less than a mile from the shore. We drove home in complete silence, knowing and fearing the worst. Everywhere in conquered Europe, the German occupation forces vigorously implemented Hitler's racial policies. For the Jewish question, as he called it, Hitler adopted the final solution: extermination. To deal with the Jews of occupied Europe, the Germans created an efficient apparatus that rounded up Jews and transported them to special extermination camps, many of them in Poland. There, the prisoners were worked to exhaustion before being shot or gassed. To Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, Sobibor, Dachau, it especially Auschwitz, the long, slow trains began to move in 1942, carrying their wretched human freight to destruction. Before the nightmare had passed, an estimated 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered. In Amsterdam, the crowds line up every day on the brick pavement in front of the house at number 263 Prinsengracht. They appear to be mostly tourists, laughing and chatting happily in a variety of languages. Once they are inside the building, their mood changes. There's nothing happy or funny about genocide. They look at the hinged bookcases that once concealed a haven for a group of Jews hiding from the Nazis. They climb the narrow wooden steps behind the bookcase, steps that must have echoed thunderously with the pounding of hobnailed boots the day the stormtroopers arrived. They whisper to each other as they inspect the cramped quarters where eight people hid for 25 months before discovered and hauled off to concentration camps. And they watched silently the slides made from a Nazi film showing a roundup of Jews and a train ride to the gas ovens. The Anne Frank House attracts thousands of visitors a year, drawn here by a young girl's account of life in hiding. I was more fortunate than Anne. I survived the Holocaust. My story began much the same way as Anne's. After the 5-day war ended, our lives did not change immediately. At that time, only German soldiers occupied Holland. We were allowed to return to school and resume a fairly normal life. I finished the 7th and 8th grade at our regular school, but we knew that this situation was soon to change. We were hoping that the war would not last too long and that our lives would not be endangered as much as my parents and their peers expected. This was not to be. In 1941, the edicts began. Jews must wear a yellow star. Jews must hand in their bicycles and radios. Jews are only allowed to do their shopping between 3 and 5 o'clock, and then only in shops which bear the sign Jewish shops. Jews are banned from trains, and all public transportation are forbidden to drive. Jews must be indoors by 8 o'clock and cannot even sit in their own backyard after that hour. Jews may not take part in public sports. Jews may not visit non-Jews. Jewish children may not attend public or private schools. I was very sad that I could no longer go to school with my friends or even visit them. I was the only Jewish student in my class. I began the 9th grade in the special school where all of the teachers and students were Jewish. Many of the teachers were college professors, not allowed to teach at the university any longer. The learning process was far from the norm, and the curriculum was quite strenuous. So strenuous, in fact, that half of my class was not promoted to the 10th grade. My sister and I had to walk to school each morning, an hour's walk. Our books were very heavy to carry, so my father arranged for one of his employees, a Gentile, to deliver the books to the school and pick them up in the afternoon. The beginning of 1942 school year saw our school population diminish by the day. It was about that time that the so-called voluntary transportation began. Jews were promised a work camp situation in Germany where they would be well treated. They went. Mostly poor Jews, lambs led to slaughter. Also, the extra razzias, the roundups, were beginning. Each day, another student failed to show in class. In November 42, all Jews residing in Holland had to move to Amsterdam. The Germans arrived at our house in The Hague and told us to leave all furniture except for our beds. We were allowed to keep our clothes and personal belongings. My parents wisely had already stored our silver and artworks at the home of Gentile friends. At that time, too, a verwalter, a so-called caretaker, had taken over my father's business since he was considered incapable of running a business he had been running for years. Ironically, our house was later bombed by the British Air Force, who had mistaken that area for military headquarters. We moved into a small apartment in Amsterdam, sharing it with a cousin of my father's and his wife. Again, we had to find a Jewish school, this time an even farther walk, and no one to carry our books. Extracurricular activities did not exist, but we got our exercise walking. I often went to see my grandmother, who was in poor health and was living with my aunt and uncle and their 3 children. By the spring of 1943, all Jews still remained in Amsterdam. Many had already gone into hiding or had been taken to the camps, had to move into a ghetto within the city. Oh, I'm sorry. Um, I'm sorry. Um, Let me see where we were. By the spring of 1943, all Jews remaining in Amsterdam had to move to a ghetto within the city. Our new apartment was in a labor-type housing on the 3rd floor. There were no washing facilities except the kitchen sink, no hot water, and no refrigerator. My father built a washstand as well as a wooden box outside a window to keep our perishables. We had to use a public bathhouse for Jews only, of course, to take our shower. One learns to do without. But we were still together. German SS made their weekly round trips, ringing all doorbells to find out which apartment housed Jewish families and which of those families were on an exempt list. Because my father worked in a Jewish grocery store, we were still on that list. One night, our doorbell rang. They were there. Our luck held. They were still looking for non-exempt Jews. Our neighbors across the hall were rounded up that night. The next day, we got word that my grandmother, my aunt and uncle, and my 3 cousins were rounded up. My grandmother, too ill to walk, was hauled off on a grocery cart. They were transported to Westerbork, a Dutch concentration camp, which served as a transit camp to the camps in Germany and Poland. They were transported to Auschwitz almost immediately. 2 of my cousins, both girls, miraculously survived. They knew that their parents and little brother arrived at Auschwitz at a time that there was no gas. This is an unconfirmed report, and were burned alive. Another sister of my father and her husband were also arrested about the same time. They died in Sobibor. My mother's parents could not face deportation. My grandfather, who started as a delivery boy, had built up a large corporation. When they took this away from him, he became very depressed, also because he was losing his eyesight at that time. They always told us that if told to leave their home, they would have to be carried out. One night before we moved to Amsterdam, they turned on the gas in the kitchen, where their faithful housekeeper found them next morning, still holding hands. We at least know where they are buried and can visit their grave. Germans, angry that they escaped them, poured gasoline on their house and burned it to the ground. There is another house now. Years ago, I put the first pole in the ground after the war, but I have no feeling for it. But I still have beautiful memories of the good times spent in the home of my wonderful grandparents during the first 12 years of my life. The weekly roundups continued. I still experience that feeling of fear whenever I hear a doorbell or phone ring in the middle of the night. I have become a parent that our exempt status would no longer protect us. It was time to go into hiding. My parents felt it'd be best for if our family split up, since chances of being caught were greater where large groups hid together. We would not know where the others were hiding. My sister and I were aided by the college student underground organization, which was part of a larger underground network. During the last few weeks before we went into hiding, we dropped off a few items such as clothing, a few books, some cherished objects, but no photographs. At a safe house until we had everything there we would need. It would have looked conspicuous to carry a suitcase wearing the yellow star. The day we had all been dreaded had finally arrived. We set our dining room table, the only room in our little flat that could hold all four of us, and found we could not speak. What went through our minds? Would we ever see each other again? Where were we going? How would we cope by ourselves without our parents? I was 15, my sister almost 14. How my parents must have suffered. I was picked up first, my parents left next, leaving my sister, whose underground worker had not yet arrived. The fears my parents must have had leaving her by herself defy description. She was picked up less than an hour later. My underground worker, whose name I never discovered, took me to the safe house to pick up my belongings after I had torn off that horrible yellow star, hoping I would never have to wear it again. We went by train to the home of a Catholic family in the south of Holland. I was sure I would be spotted immediately and hauled off to a camp, but my fear was unfounded. I stayed with this family on and off during most of my hiding years. I went into hiding in May 43, and the American Army liberated us in September 1944. The underground network also had a courier system whereby we could keep in touch with our families and who would bring our food rationing coupons. There was danger in this also, as we never had the same contact twice, and you never knew whom you could trust. My story is not unique. Thousands of Jews throughout Holland were hidden by people who could not and did not believe in the atrocities perpetuated by the Germans. My story is just one of many. At my hiding place, I was introduced as a visiting cousin whose mother was ill. I could therefore not attend school. However, I studied from the daughter's books and later took some private lessons from some understanding nuns. Somehow I managed to obtain necessary high school books and keep up with the curriculum and awarded my high school diploma after the war without having to go back to school. This diploma was recognized by the university of Amsterdam, which I later attended. The family with whom I was hiding had a son, Jan, in a work camp in Germany. When he escaped and joined the underground, the Germans came looking for him. It became too hot for me there, so I left, although I periodically returned. I went from house to house sometimes. I rode my bike in broad daylight. I had false identification papers. At other times, I had to sneak out in the middle of the night. I was always one step ahead of the Germans. In the 16 months that I was hiding, I stayed in a dozen different places. One home, which I stayed, had a family with 7 sons. They were hiding 3 other Jewish girls. When the family started to inquire about my parents' finances to see if I would make a suitable wife for one of their sons and encouraged them to make passes, I decided it was time to move again. One time I stayed in a row house with 2 school teachers. During the day when they were working, I could not move nor flush the toilet. I spent my days reading and studying. When I could no longer stand this pressure, my underground contact found me another place to stay. I was barely 16 at that time, but I was constantly making adult decisions. My sister and I went into this war as children and came out as adults, a fact that my parents found difficult to deal with after the war. We never were teenagers. This was adolescence loss. The area where I was hiding was a coal mining community, and the various families that I lived with were simple people and not well off. Bathrooms were an unknown luxury, and the fact that I washed and bathed myself every day was something they had never encountered. It was strictly wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, and keep the same underwear on all week. I contributed to the household by cleaning, washing, ironing, and darning what must have been thousands of black socks. That's another thing I will never do again. Food was not plentiful during this time, but I did not starve. My diet consisted mainly of bread and potatoes, and I became quite overweight. Many fared far worse, eating tulip soup, tulip bread, and even plain tulip bulbs. Many people during the last winter of the war in 1945 actually starved to death, mostly the poorer ones who could not afford black market prices. In spite of all the misery, fear, and pain, a sense of humor had to be maintained. There were even parties given by the underground, but they were few and far in between. In many ways, I was lucky. All the families that hit me did so out of charity and love. Many others, however, as in the case of my husband's family, demanded huge sums of money. There was always the threat that you would be turned in if the money ran out or if they wanted more than you could afford. One difficult I experienced was the fact that I could not talk to my parents. As a person going into adulthood, I had many questions, including those about sex, and I had no one to talk to. So I would send a letter sometimes for months for her reply. Although all these problems seemed very minor compared to the horrors we experienced at the time, it was very difficult. My first period, although informed and expecting us, came during my years in hiding. No one to share it with, no one who understood my feelings. A month before our liberation, the Germans came looking for Jan again. I was not there at the time because of his involvement in the underground. Since they could not find him, they took his father instead and executed him a week before liberation. His mother, a kind but fairly ignorant woman to her dying days, accused her son of killing his father. Jan lived with this guilt for the rest of his life. He died in 1985 in a mental hospital. The area where I was hiding is in the southern part of Holland. We were liberated by the American Army in 1944. I cannot describe the feeling when we saw the Germans retreat. No one dared go outside for being shot. 2 hours after the Germans left, the American troop arrived. To be free again, we did not think it would ever happen. We walked and walked so much so that I hurt, not having been outside for months. An American soldier gave me a K ration, and I, thinking it was a chocolate bar, ate the whole thing. I was sick for 2 days. I once got angry at a soldier for throwing out bacon drippings. It was also the first time that I ran into discrimination. I was talking to a black American soldier when a white officer motioned me aside. He wanted me not to talk to black soldiers, and I told him that I had been liberated by the American Army and I loved all Americans and did not care what colors they were. He shrugged and said, "You better be careful." Now that I was free, I was really on my own. Although still staying with the same family I'd been hiding with, I did not know where my parents were other than that they were in hiding in The Hague. Part of the country still occupied by the Germans. I knew that my sister was somewhere in the south too. It took me 2 months to find out where. With help, I got transportation to see her. The people she had been hiding with also agreed to let her stay, and she had come back to school. Since neither of us had any money, we had no other choice but to stay where we were until our parents would be free too. I immediately had taken a crash course uh, in typing and found a job with the American Intelligence Agency because I spoke English and could type. This way I was able to give some money to the family where I lived. I had no clothes that fit. My parents from time to time had sent us some, but all contact came to a halt that September of 1944. In February 95, I got an invitation from my aunt and uncle, my mother's brother, who had survived the war in Brussels. However, their daughter and son-in-law were killed in one of the camps. I went to Brussels. They bought me clothes, and for the first time, I felt like a human being again. I met some young people I knew, and we actually enjoyed ourselves. During all this time, though, I had no news of my parents. In the latter part of April 1945, 7 months after my liberation, I received a letter from my parents brought to me by a former Dutch underground worker. The letter took 2 weeks to reach me since there was no regular mail service. The letter came from the Dutch concentration camp, Westerbork, earlier mentioned as the transit camp. I did not know at the time what had happened to them, but they were alive. with the help from the American Intelligence Service where I worked to give me some resemblance of an American uniform and some important papers, and Jan, we immediately set out by car to Westport. This trip of about 200 miles took us 4 days. Regular travel had been suspended, and since the war was not yet over, we had to go through Arnhem and Nijmegen, where all the bridges were demolished. I found my parents, who had been free for about 3 weeks in the camp, in relatively good health. They were not allowed to leave the camp until they had a place to stay until the war was over. I cannot describe our feeling of joy at this reunion, knowing that all four of us had survived the Holocaust. That's it.